Okay, welcome everyone to this Friday's nature seminar. Before I introduce our speaker for today, I'll just mention some of the talks coming up in the next few weeks, just to whet your appetite. So next week we've got Hugh Warwick, who's a local ecologist and author, on Cull of the Wild: Killing in the Name of Conservation, that explores the trade-offs between culling and conservation. The week after, we've got Professor Jules Petty who's Professor of Environment and Society at Essex, on how story creates agency for the nature and climate crises. The week after, we have Christina Banks-Leche from Imperial on what drives species sensitivity to deforestation. Clue is not what you think. And the week after, we've got Professor Ciaran Sumner from UCL on the natural capital of wasps. And quite a few afterwards that I won't go through all of them, but anyway, a nice series of seminars. If you're not on our mailing list and would like to be, just get in touch through the website, the Nature Network mailing list. And so over to today, and it gives me great pleasure to welcome Professor David Farrier, who's come down from Edinburgh today to talk to us. And he's a Professor of Literature and the Environment at the University of Edinburgh, and his work bridges literary scholarship and ecological thought. And he's written a couple of public books. The first one was called Footprints in Search of Future Fossils, which looked at the long-term legacies of modern humanities activities. And the second one, which we'll hear about today, is called Nature's Genius: Evolution's Lessons for a Changing Planet. And this book asks what humanity might learn from other species' adaptability in a rapidly shifting world. And the book has it's doing well. It's been shortlisted for both the Wainwright Prize for Conservation Writing and the Saltire Non-Fiction Book of the Year. And he also writes for various publications, including the Atlantic, the Washington Post, and other major publications. So, David, thank you for coming over to us. I should mention afterwards we'll have a drinks reception and a book signing around the corner. So if you get fascinated by David's book, as I'm sure you will, there's an opportunity to buy and get a signed copy around the corner as well. So thank you, David. Over to you.
Thank you. That's a fantastic welcome. Thanks for coming, everyone. It's good to see you all. I want to start with a short reading that I think sets up the book. And it's a story, really. It's a story about a particular bird and how this bird came to love roads. Throughout the 20th century, the cliff swallows of Capistrano were emblems of constancy. Each spring, the birds would travel thousands of miles, from their wintering grounds in Argentina to their nests in the eaves of the Mission San Juan Capistrano in California, on exactly the same day each year, the 19th of March. Their return was greeted as confirmation that the cycles of the natural world would revolve forever, unyielding and true. Cliff swallows are a small passerine bird, typically no larger than the span of a human hand. They wear a white triangle on their foreheads and bright rouge on their cheeks over a dark cap and coat. Their wings are long and pointed, but instead of the barn swallow's elegant tuning fork, cliff swallows' tails are as squat and square as shovels. The birds dwell in cliff-face colonies of several thousand, where they build gourd-shaped nests out of mud. Their reputation for fidelity to the calendar does not rule out an ability to adapt where necessary, however. Cliff swallows were originally distributed along the California coast, but the westward expansion of the United States in the 19th century provided opportunities to spread east. Woodland cleared for pasture created fields and ponds with plentiful insects to feed on, and with each new farm and town, there were a host of cliff-like nesting sites in the shape of barns and buildings. And in particular, the birds learned to love roads. They followed wherever the highways led, building their pot-bellied nests under bridges and in culverts, in colonies of raucous thousands. Ornithologists began studying the social behavior of roadside-dwelling birds in the 1980s, and as the years passed, they began to notice something strange. Roads are typically dangerous places for birds, especially since they've come to be dominated by hulking SUVs. But as the cliff swallow population grew, Unexpectedly, the numbers killed by cars steadily declined. When the scientists compared the wingspans of road-killed birds with those of the general population, they discovered a curious difference. Road-killed swallows' wings were characteristically long and pointed, but in swallows that managed to avoid traffic, they had become short and rounded, trowels rather than stilettos. This blunter shape made the birds nimbler, better at sudden vertical takeoffs, and the knife-edge turns that would take them out of the path of oncoming vehicles. Short-winged swallows, it seemed, were just better at playing chicken. Evolution can have many different causes. A food source may decline or a new one appear. Helpful mutations can bubble up in the gene pool. Populations of different species come together, spurring one another to adapt to competition or threat, or drift apart to develop in isolation. All living forms are, in some way, a product of the combination of pressure and time. The particular pressure bearing down on cliff swallows' wings came from 3-ton SUVs travelling at high speeds. In just a few decades, these emblems of unchanging nature had evolved, and the reason was us. So that's how Nature's Genius begins. And it really is a story about change as the essence of life on our planet. This has been the story of life for 3.7 billion years. But what's perhaps remarkable about this is that life's capacity for change has become, as it has almost yoked to the ways in which we are altering the planet. Each of the drivers, the main drivers of extinction, climate breakdown, pollution, the introduction of non-native species, and habitat change, maybe there was a fourth. All the main drivers of extinction are also driving in some way many creatures to adapt their bodies and behaviors to cope with the challenges of life on a human planet. Now, before I get into why I think this is important, what I want to say at the outset is that this is not reason to be complacent. I'm not arguing that nature will heal itself, that there is a potential in other living things to simply solve the problems that we have made for them. Many species are simply too closely adapted to their niche to cope with the rate of change. Some that do change find themselves maladapted when subsequent change, outstrips their capacity to keep up. Really, those species that can adapt their bodies or behaviors well enough to thrive are the generalists. So this is not an argument that we can sit back and allow nature to kind of heal itself, but it is, I think, an opportunity for us to reflect on the valuable lessons about what it means to adapt, to change, to be more plastic. Some of the changes that we can see represent speciation. They represent what look like the beginnings of the emergence of new lineages, new species. But most of the change is, in fact, down to plasticity, the capacity that resides within every living thing to express different genes in response to new environmental pressures. It was plasticity that enabled some roadside dwelling cliff swallows to adapt the shape of their wings to cope with their new environment. Plasticity really is nature's genius for adaptation. And my book, Nature's Genius, is about how we might pursue human plasticity within ourselves. Not that we need to alter our biology, but we do, as we all know, need to change our way of life. And I think the example of the living world can help us do this. So what I'm going to do is work through a series of questions that the book asks that look at how the example of living things, other beings that are responding to the challenges of life on a human planet, and what lesson this might have for us, and how we might cultivate a greater sense of our own plasticity. So first of all, what can urban birds teach us about making more generous cities? Cities are evolution engines. They are hotspots, hot houses of plasticity and even speciation. And this is largely for kind of two general reasons. One, that they replicate many different kinds of natural habitat. Tall buildings replicate cliff faces, canals replicate rivers, cellars and subways represent cave systems, and so on. But they also furnish new opportunities for food and for warmth. And a good example of the effect that this has is the urban heat island effect, whereby urban environments can be a degree or two warmer than the surrounding environment. Snails in the Netherlands and lizards in California have been observed developing either lighter shells or larger scales to cope better with the urban heat island effect. And these are just two of a wide range of examples of ways in which some urban dwelling species are adapting their bodies or changing their behaviors to the demands of urban living. Some urban creatures, though, they don't change themselves, they adapt the city. And this is one of my favorite examples, I think, from the book. I'm sure many of you will be familiar with anti-bird spikes, these these bristling arrays of spikes you get on window ledges and cornices. They're designed to keep wildlife away from buildings, to keep the facades pristine and so on. They're a kind of hostile architecture for wildlife, you might say. Crows and magpies in Antwerp, Rotterdam and Glasgow, however, have been observed stripping these spikes away from buildings and using them to make their nests. In a wonderful example of kind of turning the city around, turning the urban environment, the urban fabric around. And it's an example of a principle that sits at a mechanism even that sits at the heart of evolution. And that is exaptation. Exaptation refers to the capacity that living things have to find a new use, a new affordance for an existing feature. So, for example, the origin of feathers. The first feathered animals didn't develop feathers in order to allow them to fly. They developed them for insulation. They were an adaptation to a particular climate that were then exapted over a large amount of time to allow for gliding and then flying. Exaptation places repurposing at the heart of evolutionary processes. So what if we were to make this the basis on which we design and build and develop our cities? Now, we don't need other species to tell us that we fundamentally need to develop circular economies. This is especially so in the construction industry, which globally is responsible for about 40% of carbon emissions. But just about every building that is erected is landfill waiting to happen. We build with a single purpose in mind, a single lifetime, with no thought to what will come after, to no thought to any kind of subsequent use. What these birds can teach us, first of all, is to build more of a kind of generosity into the way we design our urban environment. The anti-bird spikes show us that what was once a barrier, what was imagined as a barrier, can be reconfigured, repurposed as a shelter. An example of this where I live in Edinburgh is Pianodrome. Pianodrome is a performance space. As you can see, it's constructed of a number of kind of units, and it is entirely constructed down to the very nails from discarded upright pianos. Edinburgh has lots of pianos, lots of piano players, and many of them live in flats up large flights of stairs, and when they no longer want their pianos, nobody else wants them, because getting a piano up a flight of stairs is hard work. And some Edinburgh musicians didn't want to see all these hundreds, literally hundreds of pianos going into landfill. So they deconstructed them and they made Pianodrome. And it's a wonderful performance space. Events, gigs happen there all the time. It embodies generosity as a key value of design. And I think what embodies that most of all is the fact that they retained the piano harps, the soundboards, with the strings inside the bodies of each of these kind of seating units. So anytime a performance takes place in the center of this space, the entire thing resonates. It's like it remembers its past life, but it has this entirely new life, not just for playing music, but for performing it. The Anodrome embodies repurposing and generosity at once, I think. But what if we were to go further and embrace exacted design at the beginning of the process? A colleague of mine at Edinburgh called Simone Ferracina argues that we need to develop an exactive design culture, embedding repurposing, the potential to reuse materials, to deconstruct and reconstruct buildings and the urban environment at the very start. How do we remove the barriers to the reuse of the steel and the glass and everything that goes into the buildings that we make so that they don't end up in landfill? Asking that question at the very start of the process would be an act of generosity. It could be an act of generosity to our non-human neighbors, but it could also be an act of generosity to future generations. Some of you may have read Italo Calvino's Invisible Cities. It's a fabulous catalogue, literally, of fabulous imaginary cities. Any possible incredible dream city you could imagine, Calvino has already got there. And in the course of this catalogue, he describes the city of Laodomia. And the citizens of Laodomia build alongside the vast city that they inhabit, an equally vast city that they have set aside for the unborn, for the generations that are to come. Exactive architecture, however, would mean that the potential for future reuse is part of the present day fabric of our city, that buildings that have an original use would then, when that lifetime comes to an end, have the potential to be deconstructed and repurposed without the need for generating more carbon in their manufacture and construction and so on. It would make our cities fundamentally more generous places to inhabit, not just to ourselves, but to generations still to come, those who will inherit the world from us. Okay, next question. Can a mutated fish reconnect us with the world around us? This is the Atlantic tomcod. It's a relatively small speckled fish. It inhabits the Hudson River in New York. The Hudson River between 1947 and 1976 had around 6,000 kilograms of highly carcinogenic PCBs, so-called forever chemicals, dumped into its waters by surrounding industries. Now, this was devastating, of course, as you can imagine, for the ecosystem of the river. It is, in fact, now so polluted it's been designated a Superfund site by the American government. Remarkably, however, despite inhabiting one of the most polluted waterways on the planet, the Atlantic tomcod has evolved a kind of immunity to PCBs. The source of this immunity is a mutation in a single gene that is associated with the metabolism of toxins. The fish tends to it keeps to the bottom of the river. It kind of feeds around the sediment, which is where most of the toxins are concentrated because they kind of settle down into it. But despite sort of inhabiting the most deadly part of this ecosystem, this mutation means that the toxins cannot bond with the relevant receptors that would draw the harmful materials into its body and damage it. In effect, the tomcod has made itself untouchable. And I think the tomcod, therefore, embodies a certain kind of idea that we carry with us, even if we might feel we know better. And that is the idea that we exist apart from our environment. We know that we are porous. We know that we are absorbing microplastics, endocrine disrupting chemicals into our bodies, that every person alive after the advent of nuclear testing has a certain radioactive isotope, a characteristic of that moment in history, in their teeth. That we wear military and industrial histories in our bodies. We know this, and yet collectively, we still live as if we are untouchable. That what we touch in the environment touches us back. And I think this myth, this lie, is embodied by plastic. Modern plastics are designed to disappear to our touch, with the result that they blunt our sense of connection to the world. They cultivate a myth of disposability that tells us the plastic only really exists in the moment of use. It exists in our hand when we use it. It has no past that it can be connected to, and that when we discard it, it disappears. When it leaves our hand, it disappears. When in fact, of course, and we know this, every piece of plastic extends our touch, extends our reach into the living world, leaching toxins into the environment, persisting for decades. What if we could learn to feel the world again? This is Aguoha, or Aguoha 3, actually, the third iteration of a project undertaken by the Mediated Matter Laboratory then at MIT. Each of the Aguoha sculptures takes the form of this kind of chrysalis shape. They're about 5 meters tall, and they are composed of around 5,500 fallen leaves, 6,500 apple skins, and around 3,000 shrimp cells. In other words, cellulose, chitin, and pectin. Aguoha is a biopolymer. It has the malleability and the hydrophobic properties of PET, for example, but crucially, it is biodegradable. So what if we could replace all of the single-use plastics that we currently make use of? For example, 170 megatons of single-use plastic packaging that is used annually with a material like this. Obviously, that would bring evident benefits in terms of waste, in terms of carbon emissions, and so on. But perhaps equally importantly, I think, doing so would help us connect with the world that these kinds of materials have sealed us off from. I think it's ironic that many of the bioplastics that we currently use are still designed very much to look like the plastics that we have, that we've used for decades. They're designed to look like they've come from fossil fuels. And I think there's a problem with this because it perpetuates that separation. It perpetuates that myth that we can seal ourselves off from the environment that we inhabit. Imagine a world instead in which all the single-use plastics are replaced by a material like this. So when you buy some vegetables or some fruit from the supermarket, it comes not wrapped in this thin, glossy, transparent PET wrapper, but something like this instead. I think it would have a really important effect on our sense of our place in the world. Literary critics like myself often talk about defamiliarization as a function of poetry or novels. It's the job of literary writing to make the world feel strange and new again, to make the stone feel stony, is the phrase that's often used. I think this could have a similar effect, the profound strangeness, the alienness of something like Aguoha, and the oddness, the kind of almost unsettling organic nature of it to the touch would be the gateway to a kind of profound reconnection with the world around us. It would remind us every time of our connection to the living world. Every touch would remind us that we are not separate from the world, but we're part of it. Okay. Next question, how can wild clocks renew our sense of time? All life depends on coordination. Is the innate sensitivity that a creature might have to light or to temperature that makes it susceptible to and able to respond to changes in its environment. And these changes, these conditions in the world are the second component, sometimes called zeitgebers or time givers. So there's body time, the time embedded in the tissues and the cells. There's the zeitgebers, the time givers in the environment. And the third component is other living things with which that creature might coordinate its activities, its key life events, and so on, whether that's migration, breeding, diapause, hibernation, flowering, pollination, what have you. Each of those other living things, of course, have their own body time, their own time givers. So what we learn from this is that what wild clocks teach us is that in the natural world, time is a mass exercise in coordination, in collaborative time making. Wild clocks make time together. It's therefore profoundly disturbing that many wild clocks are struggling to keep time. The science fiction writer John Wyndham, who wrote Day of the Triffids, coined the term chronoclasm to describe a moment when different orders of time, rather than running in harmony, begin to clash, when there is a kind of disruptive moment when different orders of time are thrown out of joint. COVID was a chronoclasm when our time collided with the time of the virus. Climate change is a chronoclasm in any number of ways. For example, of course, we all know that climate change is running at different speeds and it's changing. Things are changing much more rapidly in the Arctic, of course, than they are elsewhere. That's another kind of chronoclasm. But for living things that depend upon the coordination of their life events with their environment and with other species, of course, a changing climate, a destabilized climate, is another kind of chronoclasm. For living things in every kind of ecosystem, time that was made together is falling out of sync. Light pollution is one cause of this, but it's principally the breakdown in seasons and seasonal rhythms, the flux in temperature, the increase in extreme weather patterns that is causing temporal misalignments between predators and prey, between herbivores and plants, flowers and pollinators. Now, all phenological relationships of this kind, relationships in time, have to be adaptable to conditions. They have to have a degree of flexibility from one year to the next. But some wild clocks are too finely calibrated to cope with the rapid or the extreme swings that we're seeing. They don't have a wide enough margin for error. This is having significant impacts on breeding, on the availability of food for young. It's having impacts on the success of migration. It's having an impact on the stability of food chains. Now, the alignment, of course, I think we probably are already ahead of me on this, but it's the alignment of industrial capitalism and clock time that is at the root of our chronoclasm. We've forgotten, in effect, that time lives in the body and that it's made together, and relegated it to the clock on the wall and to the rhythm of quarterly financial reports. So how do we renew our sense of time? The Potawatomi scholar Kyle Powys-White talks about kinship time. Kinship time describes experiencing time, fundamentally relating to time through relationship with other beings. It's about cultivating time through a sense of time givers, zeitgebers, rather than the clock on the wall. Marking time, in other words, according to the thriving, the health, or otherwise, of other species and their temporal relationships. There's both a kind of synchronic and a diachronic dimension to this, of course. It's about coordinating with the species that we live among, but also with those, the unborn, the future generations, those to whom we will be ancestors. All of this involves a kind of kinship time, cultivating a sense that time is fundamentally relational. Now, this is an idea, of course, that is common in many indigenous cultures around the world, but it is a great challenge, I think, to those of us who depend on the clock and the calendar, on the election cycle, on annual reports of GDP, and so on, to tell us what time it is. I don't know if anyone has read John Valiant's book Fireweather. It's an absolutely extraordinary read. I was quite late to it. I read it a few weeks ago, and it's an astonishing story of this apocalyptic wildfire in Fort McMurray, in Alberta, which is the center of the tar sands industry. And as this apocalyptic fire was bearing down on the town, people could see the great pall of smoke. They could feel the heat even, and yet they just carried on with their daily lives. Because the advice that was coming through from the authorities was that this is a serious fire, but we know what we're doing, carry on business as usual. And it's a perfect example of a chronoclasm. You can see what's happening before, what's bearing down on you, and yet you're stuck in a rhythm that is no longer, to put it mildly, good for you. That was a little excursion, never mind. How can kinship time help us embrace a sense of the relationality of time? I think it can help us reflect on how we make time together with the species around us, but we need help for this. We need a context. We often make our time through a sense of context, and ritual can be an important part of that. Some of you may have heard of the Future Library project. I don't know if anyone is familiar with this. Future Library is a 100-year project in which every year, it began in 2014, it will run until 2114, an author contributes a new piece of writing to the library, something that they've written for the library. No one else has read it, and it will remain unread until 2114, when a grove of trees that has been planted in a forest outside Oslo in Norway will be cut down and used to make the paper to print these works, and they will be gifted to the people of that generation. It's a wonderful example of, I think, of hope in the future, expressing hope that there will be readers, there will be libraries, there will be books. But it's also an opportunity for us, I think, it's an example of how we might cultivate a sense of kinship time. And that's because the life of the forest over that period will be one of change. I was fortunate to go to the forest, to the Future Library Grove, with a plant biologist who gave me some insight into how that ecosystem might change in the 100-year lifetime of that forest. And 100 years is not a long time in the life of a forest, and yet it's still very likely that observable change will take place. Phenological relationships are already coming under strain in that environment, but they may begin to see new assemblages form as well. Wild boar might arrive from Sweden. Beech trees might come as their range expands, and they might bring with them novel parasites like pine weevils, who themselves may adapt their breeding cycle to breed several times a year in warmer conditions, putting greater pressure on the indigenous pine trees. All kinds of changes might take place. Every year, Future Library holds a ceremony where the author delivers their work to the grove in the middle of the forest and hands it over to be held in trust. The first author was Margaret Atwood. They've had Han Kang. They've had Elif Shafak, incredible writers have committed their work to this project. And I think it's another really fine example of generosity, in fact, because you can imagine what a new piece of writing by Margaret Atwood would be worth. And yet none of us are very likely to read it unless we really look after ourselves. So there's an annual ceremony, there's a focus when everyone gathers in this forest. But the forest itself is going to change. At present, the trees, this is a sign kind of marking the way to the grove. The trees themselves are probably about that tall, but they're growing. And it will change the nature of the ceremony, the handover ceremony. It will change the sight lines. Eventually, you won't be able to see the authors, you'll just be seeing the trees. Will that change the focus of the ceremony in any way? But this annual ritual, this gathering on a yearly basis, walking through this vast forest to get to this grove, observing the changes year on year, will be a way into kinship time. It'll be a way into adopting forest time as a point of view. Forests are, of course, giant wild clocks filled with multiple different kinds of timekeeping and coordination. The advent of scientific or physical forestry in the 18th century reduced this richness, this temporal richness, to a single line on the bottom of an account book. But I think Future Library and the way that it re-engages us with the diversity and the fragility of wild clocks can help us make time again with the living, changing forest. Okay, coming up, last two. Can animal intelligence help us rethink growth? If capitalism were an animal, what would it be? Nancy Fraser asks this question in her book, Cannibal Capitalism, and she chooses the arubos, the snake devouring its tail. But I think I would choose something different. I would choose the cane toad. Poor cane toad, I know. Cane toads were introduced to Australia in 1935. They were introduced to solve a problem in an industrial monoculture. There were sugarcane beetles eating the sugarcane crop. The idea was the toads would eat the beetles. They didn't eat the beetles, but more importantly, nothing could eat the toads, or in fact, nothing could eat the toads and survive. They were highly toxic. As a consequence, with no break on their spread, they spread across the continent, and in doing so, they evolved. Cane toads, generation upon generation, as they spread out from Queensland, they developed longer hind legs and an adapted gait and more efficient forelegs. And all of this was oriented towards making the animals better at moving forwards, at expanding their range, at crossing distance. Perhaps the most important changes were, first of all, in the earliest generations, the animals, they'd meander, they'd find a nice pond and they'd stop and they'd linger there. But later generations developed this kind of relentless forward motion. They just kept moving, constantly seeking new frontiers, new spaces to colonize. And as they did so, they became victims of their own success. Their long legs leave them, an adapted gait, leave them more prone to arthritis and mobility problems. But also, cane toad tadpoles have become cannibals. The toads are so successful that their tadpoles have had to resort to feeding upon one another. They've literally become a kind of self-devouring organism. Not unlike industrial capitalism, you might say. Like cane toads, however, we also have a resemblance with them. We are fixated on a single idea, growth. Our economies are oriented around this single concept, this value held up above all else. But in nature, ideas can take many different forms. Now, cane toads evolved to become a kind of expansion machine. The economist Kate Raworth says that we need to stop thinking about markets as mechanisms and to start thinking about them as organisms, as complex, interconnected, embedded in and in dynamic balance with their environments. So how can animal intelligence help us with this? Well, in nature, intelligence, first of all, is collaborative. Organisms work together with their environment in ways that look a lot like intelligent thinking. Spiders extend their minds into their environments by their webs, and we've seen already how all species really think together by coordinating their temporal rhythms. The developmental biologist Michael Levin argues that, in fact, all individual organisms are assemblages of collective intelligence, that bioelectrical networks that power our brains resemble the bioelectrical networks in our cells, via which our cells share information, recall past events, express preferences, solve problems, and ultimately lead to expressions of collective action. We might extend this as well to whole ecosystems. Whole ecosystems evolve, they co-evolve together. They evolve, in effect, to think together. Insects and flowering plants have been shaping one another for 100 years. And to give an example, to reach the pollen of buffalo birds, buff-tailed bumblebees must grip the flower's poricidal anthers, its pollen-bearing stems with its mandibles, and vibrate them at a precise pitch to release the pollen. In other words, each organism, the bee and the plant, is a sign that the other has evolved to read and to understand and to think with in order to fulfill this vital life function. All these insights into what intelligence is in the natural world, that it is collaborative, that it is collective, that it co-evolves, shows us that intelligence is fundamentally a property of being in right relationship, in dynamic balance with our environment. And an example of this, a kind of counterexample perhaps to the cane toad, is Lauriston Farm, an agroecology co-op that is about half a mile from where I live in Edinburgh. In 2021, Lauriston Farm was transformed from a sheep farm, which it had been for decades, no one could really remember when it had been anything else, into an agroecology co-op, where the approach to growing food is embedded in both nature and in community. They prioritize balance over profit. They operate according to a rule of thirds, where biodiversity, the needs to grow food, and the needs of the local community are understood as connected rather than in competition. So the way that the space is divided up, the way in which they understand the impacts from one aspect of the farm on other aspects of it, are kind of bound up in the design and the decision making of the whole. So the allotments don't just provide food, and the market garden, they don't just provide food, they're a source of education to the local community. The farm is adjacent to one of the most disadvantaged areas in Edinburgh, increasing food sovereignty for that community. They're actively regenerating the soil and restoring wetland. But all of this is working together, and it's a profound example, I think, of the way in which a kind of denuded landscape, a kind of denuded mind can begin to think together again. I've had many different visits to Lauriston Farm. It's a wonderful part of the city. I was fortunate on one occasion to go along with their ecologist, and she explained to me the processes by which these kind of chains of living thoughts, if you like, chains of relationship where different inhabitants of the farm are beginning to kind of think together again, were taking shape. So the absence of grazing sheep, which had kind of just taken all of the vegetation down to a kind of a short sward, a kind of cropped sward, was allowing particular plants to thrive. For example, cocksfoot grass, which was, with its deep, strong roots, was breaking up this compacted soil. This was allowing wildflowers like oxeye and common daisies, chicory, field scabious, and so on to flourish. And this was bringing in hoverflies. And hoverflies have particular mouth parts that have co-evolved to feed from these particular flowers that are precisely fitted to read these flowers, to understand them, to think with them. This in turn is bringing more species of birds and bats, and it goes on and on. The field was like an entire mind beginning to think again. And it was a brilliant example to me of this notion that intelligence is fundamentally a kind of an emergent property of relationship. But true intelligence occurs between things that are in the right relationship with one another. Okay. Last question. Could assisting evolution save vulnerable species? Our very first interventions in the bodies and behaviors of other beings, of course, was domestication. And while this no doubt began in an incidental manner, of course, we know that it has become a very deliberate intervention. We have shaped certain species to the point where they are, by mass, by far the dominant presences on our planet. But what if we were to do this again? All of the examples of how we're shaping other species are unintended consequences of how we've made our world. What if we were to act deliberately? This is the Lion Man of Hollenstein-Stadel. He was carved from a mammoth tusk around 40,000 years ago. He was discovered in a cave in southern Germany in 1939, right on the cusp of the war, and in hundreds of fragments and reconstructed. What's most remarkable about the Lion Man of Hollenstein-Stadel is that he is one of the earliest examples we have of the human capacity to imagine forms that don't exist in nature. He has the kind of lower body and lower limbs of, it's not clear whether it's a man or a woman. He's conventionally called the Lion Man, but of a human. But he has the head and shoulders and the lower and the kind of the forelimbs of a cave lion. One of the earliest examples of our capacity to imagine forms in nature that don't exist. Now that we are the world's greatest evolutionary force, the Lion Man, I think, poses a question for us. Should we consciously intervene in the evolution of other species that might otherwise be lost? There are a suite of techniques and technologies that would permit this. Gene editing, using precise gene editing technologies like CRISPR, or the creation even of transgenic hybrids. Practices like assisted gene flow, which are effectively akin to domestication, where you cultivate and select for key traits. But also perhaps more radical technologies like synthetic gene drive that use gene editing technology to introduce heritable traits into particular species. Now, there are technical challenges with this. First of all, editing a genome is one thing, but ensuring that revised genome meshes well with, that it works properly in its environment and in a changing environment is another thing altogether. There's no way of knowing how an edited species will interact with an environment until it's introduced to it. But the ethical questions are at least as great, if not more considerable. Many people are concerned that this is playing God. They're concerned that this is assuming a power that we shouldn't have, and particularly with gene drive, which is the technology that is, truly empyrean. It's, you could introduce, it's a kind of extinction machine, really. With a synthetic gene drive, you could drive a species that you don't like into extinction. It's a profoundly troubling technology to have at our fingertips. But at the same time, the ICUN Red List tells us that there are around 50,000 species at profound risk of extinction. So with this range of technologies available to us and this extraordinary fragility in the natural world, can we afford not to? And one of the uses of synthetic gene drive could be to control species that were introduced to Aotearoa New Zealand by European settlers, particularly rodents that have wreaked havoc with ground nesting birds. What this would do, it would use what's called a last litter approach. So males are edited to only produce infertile daughters, and it would bring about a kind of a reduction in the population. There are mechanisms that can be introduced called a daisy chain drive, that whereby this synthetic gene drive architecture gradually breaks down with each generation, so it kind of runs out of steam. So it wouldn't eradicate the population, but it would reduce it. So it's a technological possibility. It's not just a question though of how we do it in a kind of technical manner. It's also a question of how we do it in terms of the kind of relationship that we are imagining ourselves to have with these other species. And in following that line of thinking, I think there's a lot we can learn from the insights of Maori conservationists. The Maori worldview rests on Mataranga, which is an intricate system of knowledge and values that is contoured to the specific ecosystem of Aotearoa New Zealand. And fundamental to Mataranga is the concept of whakapapa. Whakapapa is usually translated as genealogy. Maori trace their whakapapa, any individual Maori will trace their whakapapa back through each generation, but also, to the mountains, the forests, the rivers, and the lakes that they grew up around, but all the way back to the gods, the origins of life, if you like. They also understand that all living things have a whakapapa of their own, a kind of lineage. But whakapapa, although it's often spoken of as genealogy, it's not a concept that has an exact translation into English or indeed any non-Maori language. When I spoke to a Maori conservationist called Marcus Rongavitau Shadbolt, he told me that he thought a better translation for whakapapa was taxonomy or classification, because fundamentally what whakapapa expresses and what it helps Maori to identify is the relationship between things. And he told me a story to illustrate this. So back in the distant past, at the beginning times, the kauri tree and the southern right whale called Tahura were brothers. They were very close. And they lived on land. But while the kauri tree enjoyed the sunlight and being a part of the forest and so on, the Tahura, the southern right whale, longed for the oceans. He longed to explore. And so he decided to leave. And before they departed, they exchanged gifts. So the whale gave to the tree his scaly skin to protect it, which became the bark and protected the tree. And the tree gave the whale oil to protect him. And he taught the whale to sing. And off he went to explore the oceans. Several decades ago, fungal infection started to create a kind of devastating decline in kauri trees, and there was no successful treatment that anyone could come up with to arrest this decline. And then some Maori conservationists noted, some Maori healers in fact, noted that right whales were beaching themselves on the shores of Aotearoa. And they said the whale is coming back to heal his brother. They gathered up some fats and oils from the beached whales, and they created a kind of poultice and applied it to the infected trees. And they say they saw the evidence of the first successful treatment for kauri dieback. Now the results are anecdotal. They have not been confirmed by scientific studies. But Marcus was telling me this story to illustrate a more fundamental principle. He said if you said to any Maori that taking a gene from a southern right whale and implanting it into a kauri tree to make this kind of transgenic hybrid that would save the tree, they would have no problem with this because of that fundamental sense of relation that underpins the shared whakapapa of kauri trees and southern right whales. And I think this is something that we can carry away from this, that if we ever are to intervene in the evolution of other species, and I think there are many, many questions around this, to do so, we have to cultivate, first of all, a deep and abiding, grounding sense of relationship that informs what we do, why we do it, and the kind of relationships that will follow. So, for example, if we were just to edit cattle to withstand heat, which is something that's spoken about often in discussions about the affordances of synthetic biology, and we did that just so we could continue eating beef and eating dairy, and at the extent that we currently do, we would just be perpetuating a profound ecological imbalance. No sense of greater relationality, no change in our relationship would have taken place. And in fact, we would just be perpetuating a system that is leading to greater and greater destruction. But some changes can foster relation. What if we use gene editing or assisted gene flow to help tropical corals withstand heat waves? This would not only benefit the corals, it would sustain the countless species that depend upon them as their habitat, that coexist with these species and can't live elsewhere. It would create a bridge, perhaps, for us to arrest the climate breakdown that is driving tropical corals to extinction. Engineering oysters in the same manner might foster a vital source of carbon sequestration, restoring the populations that were devastated by overfishing and providing us perhaps with a carbon neutral source of protein. Again, rethinking the kind of relationship that we would have with these species would be fundamental to any kind of intervention. So I think if we're to take this question seriously, can assisting evolution save vulnerable species? The key question is not can we, or even should we, but rather would doing so, would this action draw tighter the threads that stitch us into the weave of the living world, or would it just perpetuate the unraveling that we're seeing everywhere? Okay, and I think I'll stop there. So thank you.
Lots to think about that. We can open up to questions. If anybody online wants to ask questions, feel free to just type them in as well. So anybody want to kick off?
Yeah, so
it's the online audience can hear you. Thank you.
thank you. Just to take hello.
Just speak.
All right, okay. The first example of reappropriation of existing materials and processes, I suppose. But it could apply to any of the examples you use. What sort of legislation would you have in mind to facilitate that or to encourage it to happen? I mean, I can say with recycling, you can have recycling legislation, but I can't really imagine what a reappropriation legislation would look like. Maybe you have some ideas?
I can only speak generally to that. One of the architects I spoke to who was particularly engaged in this and an advocate for a kind of exaptive or repurposed architecture is Duncan Baker Brown, who's practices in Brighton. He's part of a group that's trying to get a bill passed through Parliament. I'm not really sure at what stage they're at with this, but they're looking to introduce legislation that would require all new buildings to have a plan for the subsequent use, perhaps of at least key resources that are part of their fabric. So I don't know the detail of what's in that proposal or what stage they're at. I know that he's working hard on that. But the idea would be that there would be a requirement to think through what will happen to the steel at the very least, what will happen to the glass. Some materials may not be salvageable. But it is remarkable what can be done. I mean, again, this is working without the benefit of that kind of exactive approach at the very beginning, but there's a Dutch architecture company in Rotterdam, I think, who were charged with rebuilding a school. And rather than knock it down and build an entirely new one, what they did was they inventoried everything in the fabric of the building of that school that they were due to replace, and used that information as the basis for redesigning. So they took it apart very carefully, and they reused all those materials, but to design a completely new building. So it's been extraordinarily surprising to me to see what can be done. And there is some degree of kind of legislative discussion about how this might be embedded in practice. I don't know how far away it is or how likely it is to get through, but the possibilities are there. Yeah. Thank you.
Yeah, thanks very much for your talk. So I was curious about your conversation around intelligence. So the idea of sort of like community or like higher order intelligence, what you were describing, some people might call coevolution or ecology. And if we think about sort of the field of animal cognition, their definition of intelligence is very different. So I'm wondering, do you ever get pushback on this idea of how you're defining intelligence, and how do you answer that?
Yeah, I mean, I think there are, the counter arguments are there, and there's a great deal of uncertainty and around the kind of the diverse intelligence, debate, a lot of skepticism, even, that really what is discussed as cognition or proto-cognition is a kind of tropism. I think I'm persuaded by the notion that that fundamentally intelligence is defined by actions that further life, for want of a better term. If something works, it can be, it may not need to be kind of rational. Typically, it would be a kind of an emergent property where beings live in balance, in cooperative relationships or mutualistic relationships with one another. But that, to me, is a very good example of agency that leads to good or better outcomes, which is, I think, a good starting point for thinking about fundamentally what intelligence looks like, that it gets it out of the head and it gets us to think about what intelligence looks like through relationship. Yeah. Thank you.
Thanks, that was super interesting. I have a question about ritual. So your example was like a new ritual, the future library. It was like this new kind of pilgrimage to the grove. And I was just thinking about zeit givers or time givers that we experience on a day-to-day basis on this island, in this place. And, I mean, there's some that are universal to the world, such as the sun, sunrise, sunset, the moon. These things, this is sort of nature-based zeit givers. And obviously these have been kind of appropriated by Christianity and capitalism, and they've kind of morphed into something else that's sort of severed their nature-based aspects. So I'm wondering, what you think about this. Are you recommending a kind of reorientation towards sort of more pagan, things, or yeah? So what do you reckon?
Yeah, I mean, I think really it's whatever works. I think, and I think we're all capable of and when I say ritual, I really just mean that kind of intentional practice. We can devise these for ourselves. We can find the habits, the processes, the stories even that will create that sense of connection and rhythm for us. And I think, again, Future Library is a really good example of this, because the ceremony is different every year. There's an essential, there's a walk to the, to the grove, there's a handover, that's it. But every author brings their own dimension to it. I was there in 2020, when it just opened up after COVID, and they'd had a break for 2022, sorry, a break for several years. They hadn't been able to hold the ceremony. So there were 3 authors, Carlo Vinausgaard, Sitsi Dangaranga, and Ocean Vuong, who couldn't be there because he had COVID. But he was represented by a pair of Buddhist priests who performed a prayer. Nausgaard had a kind of performance of a medieval Norwegian poem. And so each one brought their own ritual dimension, and each year it is different. It has that flexibility, and I love that because it means that we can all find our own way of expressing a sense of kinship to the rhythms of the natural world. So that's more where I'm coming from. Yeah.
Thank you so much.
Oh, there you go.
There's a question online. Okay, there's a question online, which I'll briefly summarize. So it's about the gene drive, gene editing, and given the high percentage of vulnerable species, could a focus on gene editing for assisted evolution be a distraction from tackling the drivers of biodiversity loss?
Yeah, I mean, yeah, of course. I think that it's, I mean, there's all kinds of risks attendant upon this. In New Zealand, there have been discussions about adopting it. There has been no decision to adopt it yet, so it is still all hypothetical. That's why I thought, that risk of distraction was why I thought it was so important to think about the kind of relationship that is at the root of any action that would be taken. Because if we're simply operating out of a sense of our own potential, our technological potential, I don't think we're really changing anything, and we're actually perpetuating, as I think your questioner indicates, really quite harmful, destructive patterns and structures and so on. I thought the Maori insights to this and the Maori conservationists I spoke to were so important because it reorients our sense of what it means to be in relationship. And if we were to act like this, would it be cultivating a sense of whakapapa? I mean, not that, those of us who aren't Maori can express that, but Marcus and Tim Malcolm, who I spoke to as well, and other Maori conservationists said, you would ask yourself these questions. Does doing this foster relationality, or does it harm it? Does it consolidate, strengthen whakapapa? Does it weaken it? And I think these are such important questions, and we can extrapolate. Likewise, to do this, is it a distraction? Does it perpetuate harmful ways of being? Does it allow us to access better, more balanced ways of being? As I said, I think the use of synthetic gene drive is I think a way off. I think caution is the right approach. I'm not saying that I'm necessarily an advocate for this, but I am an advocate for the Maori approach, which is to ask these really vital questions and to act on the basis of what they tell us. Yeah.
Okay, any final question? Okay.
Thank you so much for the talk. I have a question about how you think change can happen, in terms of, all these wonderful examples, like they're in specific areas, like changing the nature of buildings or rituals. And I was wondering, how do you think change in many different areas can be united to form a systems change in the way that in nature all these different areas are all in harmony? So yeah, how can we connect all of these individual elements of change, or almost as further biomimicry in the way that nature's connected?
I mean, I think, it's cumulative, isn't it? I think it's about momentum. It's about small changes leading to, needing to larger changes, small projects connecting together. I think we know this, that we any small change in the way you live, in the way you practice being a human, opens your horizon of possibility a little further. And I think pushing through that is what we have to do. I think, though, we aren't going to, my feeling is that we aren't going to get where we need to unless we also look at ourselves. I mean, as I said at the beginning, that really this is a book about human plasticity. It's about how we need to rethink our sense of ourselves and what it means to be in relationship, in dynamic balance, as it were, with the living world. To shed certain ideas of the human and to assume better ones. And I think if we're not doing that process of reflecting as we develop new and better technologies and find new sources of energy, then I think we are going to limit the amount of change that we can see. And that's why I thought looking to the natural world was so important, because it takes us out of ourselves. It takes us out of our old ways of doing things and shows us that there is so much more potential for creativity in the living world than I think we've understood.
Yeah, sounds like a perfect point to finish on. So thank you once again. There's lots to think through there, and I'm sure we'll have some conversation afterwards. So we'll go around the corner of the drinks reception. There's also opportunity to buy and have a signed book from David as well. So see you there, and thank you once again.